Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on December 15th, 2016, and you're listening to episode 13. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Let's talk about the LPC fundraising scandal's ongoing controversies. We talked a little bit about this cash for access idea last week in response to a sort of question, but it seems to just be getting a bigger and bigger controversy.
Yeah, it kind of really blew up this week. First, the Prime Minister changed his story regarding what was said at these events. Previously, the position had been, nothing to do with any government business or anything. You know, this is just a social event that happens to cost $1,500, and the Prime Minister happens to be there. And now he said they discussed government business, and has since said that, they were just talking about the middle class, only the middle class, and the government's priorities on the middle class was the only thing Trudeau talked about to these people who happen to have business before the government.
So there's that side of it, and then there's this side on the National Post where they're talking about the amount of money that's been going into the Trudeau Foundation since Justin took over the Liberals, basically showing that both from domestic donations and foreign donations especially, starting in 2014, it's skyrocketed. It's a factor of 10 in a couple years that the money went into this foundation. The Clinton Foundation got a lot of scrutiny over that sort of ties, because you couldn't give money directly to her, but you could give money to her foundation. And there was that air of, is that buying influence? And I'm not trying to say Hillary Clinton broke any rules or was corrupt or any of that. There was a lot of conspiracy stuff around that. And I think John Oliver actually did a great breakdown of, yeah, she sort of bent the rules and it looks a little dicey at worst, but nothing's illegal there. And I'm not implying anything's illegal here, but it's that same sort of, well, this money's all coming in.
Yeah, and just to clarify a bit, the restriction here that's getting overcome is the prohibition on foreign donors donating to politicians. Both the US and Canada have restrictions on it, but if you're talking about a arm's length foundation, these rules don't actually apply. And federally, there's no donations to parties from corporations or unions, but that doesn't apply to a foundation. And same thing, there's no non-Canadian citizens donations to political parties, but these are allowed to donate to the Trudeau Foundation, or in the case of the States, the Clinton Foundation. And for example, Google has donated to the Trudeau Foundation. And so this raises some concerns over whether or not this has any sway over the Prime Minister. And Trudeau has taken a less active role in the foundation, especially after becoming Liberal leader. But as late as 2014, the foundation's advertising brochures and fundraising was talking about Justin's involvement in the foundation and highlighting it after he became Liberal leader. So there's definitely some concerns there regarding this. And from the how much sway does this actually have, I'd say this is a more concerning one than the actual donations to the Liberal Party, because it's just so much bigger, and, $1,500 isn't going to sway people too much, but $20,000 might.
Yeah, I've worked in a lot of fundraisers, and probably to you or I, dropping $1,500 to go have dinner with the Prime Minister is not going to happen. That's not, and for most Canadians, that is a big amount of money to do one little thing. But there is a sizable chunk of Canadians, that sort of, I guess, upper class, who do have that money and do have that sort of willingness to spend it. However, they'd spend a lot more. We see in BC, union and corporate leaders spend $10,000 to get a seat at the table with the Premier. And so $1,500 is this weird, like, upper middle class or lower upper class kind of level of access. And I heard it really well put on another podcast that the people who want to be heard by the Prime Minister, or that people that the Prime Minister wants to hear from, are going to get heard from. You know, the CEO of Scotiabank is going to get a voice at the table, whether he spends $1,500 or not. Like, the wealthy influence makers don't need to drop the money because they get invited to consultations that we probably don't even know about. So the fundraisers aren't that big of a scandal because Canada's politics, at the federal level at least, is pretty clean. But like, as you say, this foundation, it's murkier. I know there's a lot of rules around charities and what they can do. The charities can't lobby politically, but that's not necessarily what's happening here. It's sort of the, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, through a third party.
And we don't know there's any sort of quid pro quo here, but at the same time, that's not the only concern. There's also the more subtle, just, will this make someone just view a person more or a business interest more favorably? You know, if you also happen to have a foundation named after your father that, you know, this company that has business before your government decides to throw a bunch of money at, you know, it might not consciously register, but there is that concern that you are going to view them more favorably as Prime Minister, and that may influence your decision making.
Well, and it's exactly that perception that's the issue here. It's not that anyone actually thinks Google has made a giant influence on Trudeau through this. I mean, I'm sure there's the conspiracy theorists who believe that, but it doesn't look good. And for a government that ran on a platform of accountability, transparency, speaking to the, you know, regular people or whatever, speaking to the middle class, this is messy and this is dirty and this is going to bite him and sting him continually. And so when he talks about, oh, well, I'm being lobbied, but I'm not being influenced at these dinners, and this is just, you know, the charity and I'm not part of it right now, it doesn't wash.
Yeah, and a huge part of the problem here is that it's the apparent conflict of interest. Basically, conflict of interest guidelines, associated requirements, have a perception of influence clause in there, where not only is actual influence peddling against the rules, even the perception that there is influence being granted goes against these guidelines. And this includes Trudeau's own guidelines he set out when he took office. And that's why I think this has stunned a little more, and why they haven't been able to deflect quite as easily with the, the previous government did it, is because not only did they run on the, we're going to be better, but then they laid out their own guidelines specifically. And if it is the case, and why aren't the ministers who are attending these not the same ministers whose ministries are dealing with these people? Like, you know, if there's something before the Justice Ministry, why is Jody Raybird-Wilson go into this instead of Krista Freeland?
As you point out, this open and accountable government document that the Liberals brought in as their sort of guidelines, their code of conduct for themselves and for the government, is their sort of guiding principle. And it talks about not even looking to be corrupt. A brilliant strategic move that Alexander Boulerice and the NDP did was call on the government to make that rule the law, so that it's not just a guideline, but an actual binding document. I don't know if that can legally work or if the Liberals are even going to entertain this, but it's just a nice way for the NDP to essentially just call them out on it and say, you're not living up to this. These are your own rules. If they're so good, why not make them law?
Yeah, they've announced the intention to table a bill to that effect. Now, what'll actually happen to it, this is probably going to die on the order paper, but this is absolutely something they can push them on, is making this not just a guideline, but an actual requirement. And yeah, they absolutely should be pushing it, because even if $1,500 doesn't actually influence the politicians, the fact that there's this perception is damaging enough. And I think it's even more damaging because it goes against the narrative that Trudeau government tried to set out in the sunny ways were, going to be all about the middle class and, all that stuff. But instead it's, we're dealing with these well-connected people who have various business interests in front of the government. So it goes against that. And not only that, it goes to the long-running Liberal stereotype of being entitled, being, that well-connected, somewhat corrupt, elitist Liberal government. And I'm not sure how many of our listeners remember the Martin and late Christian era, but that's what sunk the last Liberal government and helped ensure them spending a decade in the political wilderness. And the fact that this is coming up just a year into the next Liberal government, it's a sign that there's going to be some rough waters ahead.
Well, I'm just waiting for Kelly Leach and Chris Alexander to come into Parliament one day wearing "Make Ethics Great Again" hats. I mean, that would just be a perfect image for this. The NDP would never do it.
So yeah, the opposition parties are definitely going to be hammering this one hard going into the next session. It's been the story that's really stuck the most in this past sitting. It's what's helped, I think, break the honeymoon period. We still don't have any really good polling on that yet. We'll probably be getting that pretty soon. But for now, I think we're going to expect to see this going forward, and they're really going to push on that. Now, being a majority government, there's limited options available to them in terms of actually affecting it without just creating so much bad press. Trudeau stops. And that's what's kind of confused me on this is, why has this kept going on so long?
It's absolutely baffling. They have every opportunity to clean up the act, but I think the Liberals are just bad at fundraising in a new way. So their default way of fundraising as a party is this sort of, we know all the rich people because they kind of like us, and we're just going to leverage that. We can only leverage that to $1,500 a year now, so we're going to post a lot of dinners that tick that off in one day. The Conservatives, meanwhile, and the NDP to a lesser extent, but still very much so, have the more grassroots list, the Conservatives by necessity, and as well as the NDP, where they have hundreds to thousands of small donors across the country, which is exactly what you want a political party to have, that sort of connection with the grassroots. And so when the Conservatives need money, they ask, chip in $10, chip in $100. The NDP goes, chip in $5, chip in, $25. And they have these lists, and they've grown them. The Liberals started to get there, but they seem to have just fallen back into their default old-school fundraising ways.
And yeah, that's definitely the issue for them, is they've always been much more of a small but wealthy donor pool, and they haven't built that grassroots infrastructure. And when the donation limits first came in under the past Liberal government, they were $5,000 limits, and when Stephen Harper took over, he knocked it down to $1,000 indexed for inflation, which is why it's now $1,500. And part of that was it kind of cut off that. And we aren't going to see this now with the Liberal government, but I think definitely going forward, especially if this turns out to be a one-term government, we'll probably see whoever takes over next try and make some changes to this. And personally, I really wouldn't mind it if we either drop the donation limit even more or instituted, say, a monthly or weekly cap, which would, you could still spend $1,500 a year to support someone, and, maybe not have this during the RIP period, but for like the regular fundraising thing, you get rid of these apparent conflicts of interest on a $100 a plate dinner if that was the one-time donation limit.
I don't know if we're likely to see big changes to the donation limits. What I would expect to see is tinkering around the rules so that a minister can't be at these kind of dinners if it has any possibility, and I know that's really hard to do, but that's an easier policy move to make than to cut themselves off.
The surprising thing is that's in theory what the policy already is with the apparent conflict of interest requirement, which makes it even weirder that it's still going on.
Well, and the last thing I want to touch on this story is we're coming into the holidays. We're expecting the news cycles to slow down, a lot of people to go home or to spend a lot more time with family and friends. And it's not that people talk politics and controversy nonstop when they're, with family, but it's undoubtedly going to come up. And this isn't kind of the narrative that I think the government really wants to be driving into the break. Obviously, Trudeau's not wanting this storyline, but he has this. A lot of consultations have just concluded now, like the electoral reform file, the cannabis task force has reported back, a few other things have come up, and the pipeline decision, that it generates a lot of things for people to talk about. And I think what he should have been hoping for maybe is let's just have a quiet Christmas. Maybe people can talk about the Conservative leadership race if they care, but if people are talking about the Liberals, it's probably not going to be good right now.
I'm not sure I necessarily agree. This is, as you mentioned, there's other stuff going on here. Christmas isn't really that time, and if anything, this is a good break where you can come back in the new year with a new sitting of the House and kind of just reset the agenda. Now, I don't expect the opposition to drop a couple of these issues, and we're going to see stuff like the pipelines thing continue to rear its head, but this break allows them to kind of do a bit of a reset. Everybody cools off. Some of these stories just become old news and not active fights. So at the same time, I can see there's some advantage to putting a lot of this bad news stuff late November, December, when people's minds are on the holidays.
Well, with that, let's pivot and talk about John Horgan's latest declaration, as it were, in response to the idea that the federal Liberals under Trudeau might push the Kinder Morgan pipeline through BC. I think John Horgan's wanting to take a strong stance to really sort of shore up that environmental vote, as it were, and the Lower Mainland vote. And he said, out of some motivation, we're not sure what, we don't know why, let's be honest, he said the federal government would probably have to invoke the notwithstanding clause to get the pipelines through.
We were tipped off the story by our show's legal analyst, Micah, who brought this to our attention, and specifically about all the ways this is essentially legal nonsense on the part of John Horgan. So we asked him a couple questions on this, and to kind of elucidate the legal reasons why the notwithstanding clause really doesn't have a role in the pipeline debate. So our first question is, why is John Horgan wrong? And kind of what is the notwithstanding clause, and how does it apply?
Take it away, Micah.
Hey, fellas. Thanks for bringing me back. So, the notwithstanding clause is also known as Section 33 of the Charter. It's a sort of veto on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It allows Parliament and provinces to more or less ignore certain provisions of the Charter, those specifically being Sections 2 and 7 to 15. So Section 2 contains the fundamental freedoms in the Charter. Think freedom of conscience, freedom of thought. Section 7 through to 15, those are the legal rights in the Charter. These are things like the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, habeas corpus, etc. To be clear, the notwithstanding clause has almost never been used. In fact, to use it, you literally need to write in the bill that you're passing that you are taking away fundamental freedoms. It's a very unpopular move. John Horgan is suggesting that if he becomes premier, the federal government would need to use the notwithstanding clause to develop pipelines in BC. Horgan at least seems to be suggesting, by saying if he becomes premier, then the federal government would need to use the notwithstanding clause, he seems to be suggesting that he would raise a political opposition that would require the federal government to ignore fundamental freedoms and legal rights in the Charter. First of all, from a political point of view, this makes no sense. The Liberals have predicated themselves sold themselves to the Canadian public as being the party of the Charter, to be the very first federal government to effect the notwithstanding clause and take away the rights that you promised to support for a pipeline, to me makes no sense. Alas, I am here to bring the legal perspective. So from a legal perspective, it also makes no sense. The sections of the Charter have nothing to do with developing pipelines. To me, this is like Horgan saying that if the federal government wants to bring back Canada Post door-to-door delivery service in British Columbia, well, they better be prepared to take away Canadians' legal rights. My favorite thing about this story is that Jason Kenney went after Mr. Horgan, and I'm just going to read the quote from this Globe and Mail article that I really like. So Horgan says, Jason Kenney is seeking an office, and I'll leave him to his campaigning. My job is to stand up for British Columbia, and that's what I'm doing. The irony is, it's just unbelievable.
The second question we wanted to, or at least I wanted to kind of figure out, are there any constitutional levers for proponents or opponents to use to either force the pipeline through or to block it entirely?
The issue of jurisdictional battles between the province and the federal government is a podcast to itself. And I don't mean an episode. I mean like an entire podcast series. Jurisdictional issues, it took me 4 months to get a fairly rudimentary understanding of jurisdictional battles. And I'll try to more or less present two very basic points, but at the outset I should say that it's a nuanced issue, and the sort of issue that is almost impossible to present in less than a 1.5 hour lecture. So let me say, on a sort of first blush basis, the federal government is more or less equipped with whatever they need to ram pipelines through political opposition. On the first hand, they have the paramountcy doctrine, which states that if the provinces and the federal government try to regulate the same thing and the regulations that they pass come into conflict, the federal government wins. So on a very, very basic level, if British Columbia tries to pass something in contradiction to what the federal government has passed, then the federal government will win out. Second, there's this principle of interjurisdictional immunity. That is, if a matter is within one level of government's jurisdiction, so let's say the federal jurisdiction, that matter in certain circumstances can be held as being entirely immune from provincial law. There's a two-step test associated with this. First step is the provincial law trying to regulate something that is in uniquely federal jurisdiction, and second is the effect of the province's law sufficiently serious. Now, the province's out is that the second principle, which I just described, at least theoretically works backwards and forwards. That is, if the federal government passes a law regulating something in provincial jurisdiction and it has sufficiently serious effects, then it may be immune from federal regulation. Under Section 92, subsection 13 of the 1867 Constitution, provinces have jurisdiction over property and civil rights in the province. Unfortunately, for the provinces, that is, Section 92, subsection 10A, and one could probably argue subsection 10C, carve out interprovincial works and undertakings, that is, projects that span provincial borders, like pipelines. Those are in the purview of the federal government. Now, I'm going to put the legal issues aside for a moment. Practically speaking, if the provinces want to tie up these projects through litigation, they probably can. Regulations and other legislation, really any red tape, is perfect for slowing down any project. The problem is that this would come at immense cost to the taxpayers. And if the NDP is in power, I know that they're going to want to demonstrate themselves as being good fiscal leaders. I don't think that they're going to want to take a politically unpopular step of throwing money at lawsuits. So maybe if the provincial government did decide to start this string of litigation, the federal government would, after all that, try to take away the province's legal rights, and maybe the notwithstanding clause would come into effect. That's a joke, by the way. It does not work like that. That is not how the notwithstanding clause works. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Till next time.
All right, thank you, Micah. I don't necessarily agree that John Horgan's going to be quite so reluctant to tie this up in court if he becomes premier. Political history is replete with politicians filing and fighting losing legal battles that are politically popular. And for John Horgan and his base, fighting Kinder Morgan is popular. And it may waste taxpayers' money, but I mean, as we saw with the last 10 years of the federal government, that's not always the primary concern when it comes to politics, and it's often much more about kind of the virtue signaling towards your supporters of standing up for the good fight, even if it's ultimately doomed.
Even at the provincial level, we've seen Christy Clark fight the same teacher battle over a decade and really not give a shit that she clearly was just breaking contract rules and not trying to be negotiating in good faith.
And people like teachers. They don't like pipelines in most cases.
That all said, I think I side a bit more with Micah on this specific one, or the specific question of John Horgan fighting the pipeline. I think he can distance himself and let the local First Nations, let the cities, let everyone else really do all the fighting and the heavy lifting on this. And he can go, well, if the local communities want it, I'll let it go through. But he doesn't actually have to do the dirty work. He doesn't have to file suit. Maybe the provincial government could intervene, but maybe he just sort of sits back and lets the winds go and focuses on any number of other controversial issues he'd have to deal with if he became premier. The other thing I want to challenge Mike on is I wouldn't put it past any government at the federal level when it becomes convenient to consider using the notwithstanding clause. Obviously, it hasn't really been used in the past, but this party of the charter, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's party, as it were, was the one that invoked the War Measures Act in Quebec. Just because they brought in the charter doesn't mean they are, flawless on civil liberties. I don't think any government's likely to use the notwithstanding clause, but I wouldn't rule it out categorically.
Well, it's basically the nuclear option, and governments are fairly reluctant to do that without, a huge public backing for it. It's why you basically only have ever seen it happen in Quebec, where there is that huge public backing for measures that, defend the French language, even if it means trampling on a few charter rights. But in, the broader Canadian context, I just don't really see that happening. I mean, we've got a couple of conservative leadership candidates floating a few trial balloons on it, but it's never going to go anywhere because even if they really care about something, it's such a, political grenade that nobody wants to pull the pin on it without some really good reasons and, just a huge upswelling of public support, and a pipeline is just not going to reach that level. Even the Wild Rose in Alberta, if they were to form a government, would be reluctant to touch the notwithstanding clause to get a pipeline built.
Well, and you also don't want to be the one who invokes it to set that precedent of, now we can use it. Because then your opponents are more likely to use it. That's where it comes back to the nuclear option sort of level. We leave this off the table so that we don't hurt each other.
It's kind of almost getting to a quasi-constitutional convention at this point, that it doesn't get touched. It's kind of dead in the water.
I want to swing back to the impetus for Horgan's comments. He's obviously trying to appeal to the sort of environmentalists, the people in the Lower Mainland who don't want to see this pipeline come through. But it's so weird to sort of go from that and try to stake out, yeah, I'm fully on your side, to jump to, well, they'll have to use the notwithstanding clause. As Micah points out, legally it makes no sense. It's almost, to me, and I was thinking about this a bit earlier, that he's trying to suggest I almost wonder if he's bringing back the comments about, oh, the federal government is prepared to bring in the army if they need to stop illegal protests. And I wonder if there's sort of a connection there. Obviously, if the protests are illegal, you don't need to suspend civil liberties to arrest people. We have limitations on all of our rights that are reasonable. That's what Section 1 of the Charter basically sets out. But it's this weird tension that maybe he's trying to go, well, people are going to non-violently protest and the government will have to suspend their civil liberties to stop them. And maybe that's where he was trying to get to the notwithstanding clause without saying it, without saying, I endorse this kind of protest.
Yeah, kind of get into the, we're going to raise such a stink about it and have such a massive protest that they'll either have to back off or use the nuclear option.
So I guess in that case it is just maybe the signal to the sort of radical base, but it's a weird sort of whistle to blow that makes him sound legally naive.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, John Horgan doesn't have a legal background, but he's been in politics long enough. He should have a basic understanding of the general constitutional framework, especially if he wants to be premier.
I don't doubt that he knows what he's saying. Being leader of the opposition, he'll craft his words and choose them carefully, which makes this all the more, not troubling, but questionable. Like, who's advising him? Who thought this was a good message to go? It's
more the sort of thing you'd expect Elizabeth May to say than John Horgan.
Maybe John Horgan's just trying to out-Green Party the Green Party, because Andrew Weaver's been too reasonable and moderate.
Yeah, but it's a risky play for him. I mean, we this is something we bring up time and time again when the pipelines and the NDP come up, but he doesn't have a unified party behind him on this. And over the past couple of weeks, some NDP members have come out basically saying, no, this is a bad position. It's about, we need jobs. This is something that's going to help the BC economy. And he doesn't have that, completely unified, everybody's marching in lockstep the way, the Green Party is on the pipeline issue, or on the opposite side, the Conservative Party is. And because of that, this seems like a very high-risk position, or high-risk approach. On the other hand, it is definitely better than the Adrian Ditt's approach of taking all possible positions and nobody taking you seriously as a result.
Dan Miller, who was the interim NDP premier after Glenn Clark and before Ujjal Dosanjh, came out this last week saying, look, our federation is based on this idea of provinces working together, and the landlocked provinces need the coastal provinces to help them get their stuff to market. So BC has somewhat of an obligation to work with Alberta to make sure this pipeline goes through, which was a pretty sharp break from what Horgan's talking about right here. But I also completely agree with you that if Horgan takes the same play it safe approach that Adrian Dix did, that to some extent Tom Mulcair did, he's not going to go anywhere. He's maybe being a bit smarter than that. And pivoting to the radical environmentalists, it's an approach. It's something. Maybe it's not the right thing, but there's something to be said for, invigorating your base, especially 6 months out from an election, where he could then pivot back to a bit more moderate if he can build up the enthusiasm.
Yeah, I definitely see there's a good approach in that, but it strikes me as one of the higher risk methods of going after it, and not every party needs a position on every issue, and if you want to invigorate the base, it's not like there isn't stuff in BC you can invigorate the base on. I mean, we're in the midst of a housing crisis, and up until the pipeline got approved, that was where the NDP was getting the most traction. And if you don't have a unified party behind you, maybe find something else you can kind of rouse everyone behind and leave the controversial split the party, alienate part of the base issues. You have to say something about them, but maybe that's not the fire you want to stoke.
I don't think he couldn't be quiet on this. And obviously you're saying he can say something, but anything he says is going to get seized upon. And the NDP is taking a lot of flack, including from us, for not being that public or not being that visible. And so if they have an issue they can get out there on, I can see why they want to take it and they want to jump on it and use that. And I can see why he's taking sort of the strong anti-pipeline stance. It's going to prove popular. Of course, he doesn't need to run up the scoreboard in Metrovan to the expense of the rest of the province, but I'm still not convinced that these pipelines are more popular in the interior than they are in the Lower Mainland, mainly because it doesn't benefit BC a whole lot in the long run. That's not to say the opposition is as strong in the interior as it is down here, but we'll have to see. Next up, let's come back to the Conservative Party leadership race. We have a few quick stories to run through there.
First off, we got a new poll out, conducted by Forum Research on the state of the Conservative Party leadership race, both where the candidates stand with self-identified Conservative reporters and the general populace. Among identified Conservative lean-in voters, Steve Blaney, surprisingly enough, tops out at 9% and leads the pack, followed closely by Michael Chon, Lisa Raitt, and Tris Alexander at 8%. And kind of going down from there, the remainder of the pack. The real surprising one on that to me is Maxime Bernier at 4%. And overall, 49% of self-identified Conservative leaning voters have a someone else, or basically the undecided camp.
So this is basically a tie among everyone when you're split between the bottom and the top. And it should be pointed out, Forum left a few of the contenders out just because they felt like giving people a list of 14 names wouldn't actually be useful. And there's good methodological reason for that, because sometimes you can add a made-up name and they will score higher than everyone else. I think that's why we see Steve Blaney at a fairly high number. No one knows who he is, so he's probably okay.
Yeah, you basically have to have seen the leadership debate where he got oddly angry about supply management to even have an idea who he is.
But, he's only a couple points ahead of 4 other people, and within the margin of error, it's essentially a 7-way tie for first among the supporters. Among the broader population, it's even more embarrassing for them. People aren't just aren't following it, is what you can take from this.
Or if they are following, nobody's really stood out. And among people who stated they have a Conservative Party membership, now this is only 65 people out of the 1,304 respondents on the poll, so not the most statistically rigorous sample. Lisa Raitt actually leads, followed by Michael Chon at 12 and 10% respectively. But same thing, just a whole lot of undecideds. Nobody's really seems to have made up their mind too much, which means a lot of those second and third choice votes are going to be, and first choice votes for that matter, are going to be up for play, and there's still a lot of work to do, and the field's going to have to narrow before the May vote.
Well, and the Conservative leadership race is weighted by riding, and so unless the pollster is able to get Conservative voters in every province and sort of balance that, you can't really do an effective poll of this. It's really hard to poll this kind of race. And we still don't think we have everyone in the race, because finally Kevin O'Leary, who wasn't mentioned in this poll, he's been included in a few previous polls and actually done pretty well just on the name recognition. He's now starting to make some noise that he could take down the surfer dude Justin Trudeau with his economic wisdom, and he started to throw some tweets out there that are structured on that same terrible Donald Trump style where they end with an emotion. Sad.
Yeah, Kevin O'Leary's definitely one to watch because he just has that name recognition. Now, so far his policies seem to be winning in 2019, so, I mean, he has good company with Lisa Raitt on that one, who basically that's her policy too. But that celebrity name recognition could be a decisive factor when there's a lot of people here who just haven't really captured the support of Canadians. And even on the general public, the top person in this poll among Canadians in general, Michael Chon, only got 10%. So there's still a lot of room to go here. And I mean, I hope he doesn't enter the race just because there's no real depth of policy experience, and the last thing we need is to throw even more celebrity into politics, but we're going to have to watch and see.
From what I've seen, at least, I'll say this. Kevin O'Leary has the celebrity going for him, but I don't think he has the heart of pure hatred and evil that is Donald Trump. I'm not saying Kevin O'Leary is a great, compassionate liberal at heart. I don't see him going on stage at a rebel meeting. Well, maybe he will. Fuck it, I don't know.
I could see him doing that for the publicity. He definitely seems to be one of those any publicity is good publicity people, but to the extent that he has a defined policy position or governing ideology, it would seem to be more libertarian light than anything else. I mean, he's a well-connected Torontonian. Typically, those aren't the sort of people who, want to go back to the 1950s.
Yeah, I don't see him putting white supremacists in the Chief of Staff office or in cabinet. I do see him nodding along and saying evil things because, as you're just pointing out, that's actually more dangerous potentially than the pure evil when they're just willing to do evil if it is popular and then they just follow the winds. And there are some dark winds blowing right now. So yeah, let's hope he doesn't, because then I will be happier with our conversations next year.
Yes, and it's, you bring up a good point about that, just saying stuff to get attention. Kelly Leitch is riding this strategy fairly well. She went from basically a who in the race to one of the main contenders based off this, and everything she said prior to 2016 would indicate she holds none of the positions he's actually espousing on this campaign, but she's got more press than any of the other candidates because of those positions, and you can see O'Leary following a similar strategy.
Well, it's our whole media's awful desire to find the Canadian Trump, and we've been somewhat guilty of it ourselves, so I don't know how we play it going from here. But let's talk about policies, I guess.
So Kelly Leitch actually came out with a policy that on the face of it isn't that crappy, which I guess points for her for kind of rising above her previous level. But I mean, there's still a lot to criticize on this, and this is her announcement that she wants to enact citizen referendums. Basically, if 3% of the registered voters can sign a petition, they can get a referendum called on a given issue. And this harkens back to the campaign pledge Stockwell Day made when he was leader of the Alliance.
It's a popular one among that sort of Reform Party base of the Conservatives. And on the face of it, it's something I think a lot of people can get behind, the idea of direct democracy. We have citizens' referendums here in BC, and that can give citizens a good way to sort of talk back at politicians who take them for granted. For Kelly Leitch, this is a really easy meat to throw to the base. Most referendum bills have a pretty high threshold, and 3% doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that's still hundreds of thousands of Canadians. And, I haven't seen the text of what she proposes or what it would be like in the end, but if it still requires a paper petition, it'll take a lot of effort to get that through. And in the end, it'll probably mean no referendums actually get triggered, but it still shows that she's putting that out there.
So that works out to 527,000 people need to sign a referendum. So that's going to be a lot, and it's going to be a high threshold to cross. Now, I think there's a general problem with putting a lot of policy to referendums. I've spoken in favor of them on the electoral reform issue, but for most general day-to-day government issues, you really don't want to put it to a referendum. You want that considered opinion of people who have kind of the experts to help guide them, like the MPs do, and you also have to factor in trade-offs. When you're in government, you have to factor in all the trade-offs, and if you cut taxes, you're going to be faced with a budget deficit, for example, but if you're just voting, do you like taxes, yay or nay, in a referendum, you can find yourself in a pretty unhealthy position where you've put forward mutually contradictory positions on through a referendum, and there's that kind of single point where they all get reconciled, and you get to have an issue like California, which has had huge budget problems because of referendum enacted limits on budgets and tax increases. And as such, I kind of see referendums as primarily should be limited to kind of the really big questions that aren't policy so much as kind of like the foundational questions about where we want to be as a country, like referendums on sovereignty, referendums on kind of the relationship between the citizens and their elected representatives, but the day-to-day governing issues, probably not best to put to a referendum.
In the end, I think this is kind of a throwaway policy that there's people who care a lot about it that want to see it in there, but in reality, it's not going to end up working for them. It's just going to be that sort of either impossible bar, or if it's too easy, we'll end up like California, which has about the same number of people, but dozens and dozens of referendums and ballot initiatives on every election, including ones that contradict each other.
So the other bit of policy announcements to come out of the Conservative leadership race this week is Aaron O'Toole. He put forward a couple policies, and the main one I want to touch on now is supply management. He put forward his agricultural policy earlier today, and oddly enough, he's defending supply management, which we've touched on in the past year, but the short version is some agricultural products, namely dairy and poultry, have a strict limit on who can produce and sell them in Canada, and that generally leads to higher prices at the grocery store and more profits for the lucky farmers who happen to have those quotas. And what really strikes me as odd about this is how it's just kind of the antithesis of the free market conservative position that you'd expect somebody running for the conservative leadership to be putting forward. And, to Maxime Bernier's credit, he has, but nobody else really seems interested in this file. And I can get that it's kind of a wonky thing. As much as I complain about having to pay too much for cheese, it's not the sort of thing that really moves votes, but at the same time, it's an odd thing to kind of stake your ground in defending.
As someone who came from a small Alberta farm where we did have chickens and eggs, I think I can see the other side of this. The conservative movement as a whole isn't always so ideologically driven as we like to think. Political parties are often portrayed as very ideological, but in reality, they're just coalitions of people who are kind of similar. And a lot of the conservative voters and the base of the Conservative Party are just farmers across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And those are the people who like things sort of how they are. For a lot of farmers, it helps them and it, keeps their livelihood. A lot of the US farms are going under and getting corporatized and bought out. The argument is this keeps family farms going, whether it does in reality or not, and whether even it makes sense on a longer term policy initiative. Obviously, we can debate those, but I think it's too easy to just dismiss this as, oh, he's just trying to buy votes.
Yes, and there's always that kind of political calculus you have to consider. But there aren't a huge amount of dairy farms in the country, so it's not the sort of thing you'd expect you'd be able to rally a huge amount of opposition to just because this is such a small group of people. And touching on your point about the consolidation of the farms and how they're being bought up, Martha Hall Finley, a former Liberal MP and leadership candidate at one point, has done an in-depth analysis on the supply management issue and showed that dairy farm consolidation, while not quite as high as the US, has basically tracked along with the US, just with a slight reduction. I believe it's something like a 90% reduction in the US to an 86% roughly, so you're still seeing that consolidation. And when the right to milk a cow costs $250,000, which is the market value of a dairy quota, this isn't the little farmer being helped out here. I mean, that's a huge capital investment for what is basically nothing more than the right to be part of a cartel. And so the supply management things always struck me as a little weird on kind of the ideological grounds. That's the one area I wish conservatives were a little more ideological on. But the kind of the flip side of this is, it's always struck me odd how the NDP and kind of the left haven't really got on board with it. The NDP being the long defenders of supply management, which is kind of weird when you think about it, because, this is a small group of essentially business interests running a cartel that, now it's legal cartel in this case, but running a cartel that raises the cost of staple goods for Canadians, and it's essentially a very regressive way to help the dairy farmers. And, the people who hurt the most from this are the poor families who have to spend what's typically about 2 to 3 times the average world price for dairy products.
Well, no one wants to be seen beating up little dairy farmers, as shrinking a number as that is. But, overall, I think I take your point, and it's just this sort of difficult policy issue, I think, for most Canadians to really latch onto, which is why it kind of gets studied and talked about in wonky circles, but sort of ignored wider than that. Yeah,
and I could definitely agree with that, and the wonky side of me is at least happy it's getting brought up, and that, there's an active policy debate going on in the Conservative leadership race, and, for all its other flaws that have surfaced over the course of it, we at least credit them for that.
All right. Well, speaking of wonky policy debates, let's discuss a sort of shallow one, I guess. Christy Clark has announced a new home buying loan program where new home buyers will essentially be given a 5-year interest-free loan from the provincial government to help them get a new house. This is her claimed way to help housing affordability, and as someone who will probably be able to take advantage of this next year, I definitely like that I can get sort of free money, interest-free money for a while, but it doesn't solve that problem at all. It doesn't open up new homes. It's not tackling the supply question.
Yeah, this really goes to show the incoherency of the government's housing policy. You have all these really restrictive zoning rules and a permitting process that can take years to get a project off the ground, leading to higher prices. So you're basically clamping down on the supply and then subsidizing the demand. And it's basically what the government's doing. They have their foot on the brake and they're pressing down on the gas and hoping that we could get to a reasonable speed on this. And it just doesn't make sense at all from a basic policy perspective.
Yeah, the problem is too many people want homes. And this makes it easier for more people to get homes. For all the flaws of basic economics, at the very core level, yeah, if more people want something, prices are going to go up when there is a fixed number of that thing. So this is a nice play before the election for her to try to look like she's helping. But overall, yeah, it's terrible policy.
Yeah, that's exactly how we got into this mess, is all these little things. They like the idea of, this little policy is going to help with affordability, or this will help preserve the neighborhood. And when you throw it all together, the end result is sky-high prices, the government shelling out a bunch of money to try and make housing more affordable, and the whole thing just being this mess of contradictions. So yeah, we'll expect to see this be basically a election ploy I expect to see this feature fairly heavily in the platform once it gets announced during the election, but other than that, I don't think we have a huge amount more to say on this.
Well, on the subject of Vancouver housing, the city of Vancouver has decided to increase everyone's property taxes. This is a small increase, which they estimate will be in the tens of dollars per year per household. And they're going to take that money and help tackle some of the overdose and fentanyl crisis that's happening right now. Essentially, it's the city saying, we need more money. The province isn't stepping up. The federal government hasn't stepped up enough. Let's get this money and let's save some lives in the city.
Good for the city to put some more resources into this. I don't like the idea of raising taxes to do it, and part of the problem is governments at the city level are pretty limited in their financing options. For the most part, they can't take out debt except for, major capital projects. And this is exactly the sort of short-term issue that you actually want to be able to have a little flexibility in an ideal world to take on maybe a little debt to help address this and direct some more resources into it rather than play around with tax policy on a kind of short-term case-by-case basis, reacting to every little change in the city. You want a kind of stable tax rate that's predictable, isn't going to change in response to every little tiny thing. But I can appreciate that the city's hands are a little tied on the issue and they had to find money somewhere.
I'm also concerned that it's sort of Vancouver's taking a different approach now than Burnaby, New West, Surrey, Richmond, the rest of the Lower Mainland. And you'll have this disparity. You have overdose crisis happening in Surrey just as much as you have in Vancouver. I mean, it's different neighborhoods and it's slightly different demographics, but it's not true to say this is only happening in the downtown east side. And it's become this sort of urgent crisis that needs to get dealt with. And I think this just really is the city going, all right, no one stepped up. We have to step up now. The federal government in the last week has started to talk about how they're going to review their policies and shift their approach on overdoses and addiction from a sort of justice point of view to a more health point of view and bring in a lot more harm reduction. And the province is sort of cheering that on too. But those are all sort of down the road. And meanwhile, people are dying right now and it needs to be dealt with. Well, speaking of dying, the Canadian federal government has announced its necessary studies of the assisted dying legislation that was brought in June. One of the amendments that the Senate managed to get through was that there would be a review of some of the classes that were left out of the bill that were required by the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling. So these studies are going to look at, should there be advance consent provisions? Should people with mental illnesses be eligible? And what about mature minors? These are all classes that you can access other medical services through. And these are all classes that advocates for assisted dying, including myself, have lobbied hard for. And yet the government's approach to studying this, instead of a parliamentary committee that would put forward recommendations, is to sort of throw it to the Council of Canadian Academies to do a more academic review, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it's good they're doing this. The only question I really have is, isn't this about a year too late? They knew this was coming down the pipe when they took office, and this committee and the study should have been struck right after they took over in that short sitting right after the election before the Christmas break in 2015. So it's just kind of odd they're doing it now when they should have done it last year, but instead they dragged their feet and didn't really get around to writing the legislation until the deadline was upon them.
Well, and they did actually have a committee study these questions. They had the special joint Senate House of Commons committee that did a lot of actually great work in a very short amount of time. And that committee actually dealt with most of these things. They said advance consent can probably be in there. They talked about how these things could be dealt with or could be dealt with pretty quickly right after bringing legislation forward. And they didn't include any of the wording around reasonably foreseeable death that the government ultimately chose to bring out of nowhere into their legislation. So advocates like Dying with Dignity Canada are rightly aghast at this sort of study that's almost kicking it to the ivory tower, where it can be talked about in philosophical levels, where Canada's moved on from that. We're now in the practical, we're doing this. Lots of people are actually accessing this as it is. But we need to move away from, studying this at an academic level and just going, all right, how do we ensure that the Canadians who are entitled to this right under the Carter decision have access to it?
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or where you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.